So, Chris, if you like, we can start. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded, since can be available to our partners later. And thank you very much for your disposal on this point. Well, for everybody, thank you very, very much to Christopher Seppala. He is a world reference in terms of construction, especially international contractions and projects, international and national also arbitration. He's based for a long time already in Paris, in Waitai case, and he also has been participating for a long time as a professor and also to a legal advisor and also a member of the FIDIC task force teams and groups for a long time. He's a real authority in FIDIC matters and construction and national and international construction matters, both litigation, arbitration, and also legal advice. So thank you very much, Chris. For us, it's a pleasure. It's a real honor to have you with us. Thank you also, Juan Eduardo, who is our former director of the Society of Construction Law in Chile. Also to everybody who is with us today, to our former president, Mr. Oscar Aiken, Julio Cesar Bueno, who is connected from Brazil. Well, everybody of our partners that is today with us. And after these short words, I will give the floor to Juan Eduardo and to Chris to continue with this presentation. I will share some presentation from Chris in the meantime. Thank you so much. Please, Juan Eduardo, continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Victor. Good morning to everyone. As Victor said it's a great honor for us to have Chris Seppala this morning. The idea is to have, first of all, a general view about contracts, and mainly in the field how could be applied in Latin America. And after that, we will have the chance to give some time to talk with Christopher and to ask some questions and exchange some ideas. Please, Chris.
Yeah, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Victor, for your kind remarks, and thank you, Juan Eduardo, for yours. It is a pleasure and an honor to speak to you about FIDIC contracts this morning. And what I propose to do is, and really all I can do in the half an hour or so that I'll be talking, is to give you just a very general overview of FIDIC contracts. And this is actually based upon a talk I gave last year, which several of you will be familiar with. But Victor thought that I didn't really need to change the PowerPoints. I could just use the ones I used last year as they cover the topic that it was felt I should deal with today. So maybe we could look at the first PowerPoint after this one, Victor. Yes. No, excuse me, before that. I think there's okay. Well then, no, I'm sorry. Let's go to the next one then. Just so you know, I'm going to talk first about the FIDIC forms of contract, the existing ones. Then I'm going to talk about new ones that have just been issued in the last couple of years. And then I'm going to talk about the use of FIDIC contracts in the Americas, and in particular in Latin America, and describe what we know about their use. And I'll make some comments upon how I see the future. I'm speculating, of course, but the future of FIDIC contracts in Latin America and in the world generally. But let's begin by, and I've outlined them in the PowerPoint, by looking at what are the common or distinctive features of FIDIC contracts. And I've made a list of them in the PowerPoints. But I'd say perhaps the first one is that they are recognized as representing good, they're recognized internationally as representing good contract practice for the construction of infrastructure projects of all kinds. Things like, of course, dams, bridges, roads, airports, those kinds of things. They're generally recognized today, I would say, as being the best known and perhaps the most respected international standard form of contract. So they're considered to represent good international construction contract practice. Now, the first edition of a FIDIC form of contract was a contract commonly referred to as the Red Book, which is for civil engineering works, and that was published in 1957, and it was based upon an English standard form of contract, issued by the Institution of Civil Engineers in England, and that was because that English standard form of contract had been used quite a lot internationally before 1957 on international projects, not just where English parties were involved, but generally in international projects after World War II. But the FIDIC contracts were not that, although the first one was issued in 1957, they were not really much used, I would say, until the 1970s and 80s, following the quadrupling of oil prices in 1973-74, as the result of another Arab and Israeli war. If you remember, oil prices were quadrupled and have continued to remain very high ever since. Before 1973, oil prices were $3 a barrel or less. Well, they were, as I say, they were quadrupled at that time. And since then, of course, oil prices have been up to $100 a barrel and more. And that has resulted in a vast transfer of wealth from the developed world to the developing world, and particularly the oil-producing countries. And the oil-producing countries, in turn, use that wealth that suddenly they receive to build the basic infrastructure for their countries, because many of these countries, for example, in the Middle East, were little more than desert kingdoms. They had no modern infrastructure. But with this oil wealth, they could build it, and that's what they did. And that really contributed to the development of the Middle East from being a series of desert kingdoms to modern states, as is the case today. But it's not just the oil-producing countries that have financed through the higher price of oil, the building of infrastructure worldwide. Also, the World Bank and the multilateral development banks have been financing the building of infrastructure around the world, including, of course, the Inter-American Development Bank in Latin America. And these banks, and also private banks in New York and London, when they're financing a project, they insist that the project be constructed in accordance with good, indeed the best, contract practice. And so these banks who provide the money to build infrastructure, they are requiring the use of the FIDIC forms of contract. For example, the Panama Canal expansion, which is still going on, is a private project, but it was financed by banks in New York, maybe in London as well, but for New York. And those banks in New York said, okay, we'll finance this project, but we want the construction contracts to be based on the best international contract practice. And so the Panama Canal expansion, which is a multi-billion-dollar project, is being conducted based on the FIDIC design and build or yellow book contract, because that's considered to represent, best international practice. That's just an example, but we'll be looking and see other examples. So that's the first point I would make about FIDIC forms of contract. They represent good and considered good, if not the best, international contract practice. Secondly, they provide for a fair risk allocation between the employer or owner on the one hand and the contractor on the other hand. And how do they do that? Well, basically by saying that the contractor is expected to price for all foreseeable risks of a construction project, because a contractor can estimate and put a value on foreseeable risks, and the employer is expected to bear all unforeseeable risks, such as force majeure risk, for example, or other risks that a contractor cannot reasonably have been expected to calculate and estimate and price for when negotiating and preparing to enter into a construction contract. Anyway, it is generally recognized, I think, in the international construction industry, that the allocation of risk between the employer and the contractor is a fair one. And that's, of course, very important. Contractors generally are very happy if they get a FIDIC contract, which has not been changed very much by the employer. That's my experience. Thirdly, another very interesting thing, although these contracts are very complicated, some of them, when we're talking about, I'll say more about the civil engineering contract, that's the so-called Red Book, that runs to over 100 pages. The general conditions run to over 100 pages. And similarly with the other contracts, the Yellow Book and the Silver Book I'll be talking about, each of them the general conditions runs to over 100 pages. And that's just the general conditions. Of course, we know that construction contracts contain a lot of other documents than the general conditions. But those general conditions are drafted by engineers. FIDIC is it is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, and FIDIC drafts these forms of contract because they're meant to be working documents for use by engineers on construction sites, and therefore they need to be intelligible and useful to engineers, and that's why they're drafted by engineers, not by lawyers. Although lawyers are consulted on, things like the disputes clause, arbitration clause, and certain things like that, but the main drafting is done by engineers. Now, the next point I'd like to make is, there are a number of different FIDIC forms of contract. They all have a kind of common terminology, a common format and structure. So although each one is long, as I said, the general conditions are over 100 pages, and there are various annexes or appendices I don't have time to go into. But the thing is, if you become familiar with one of these forms, that allows you much more easily to understand and access another FIDIC form, because these forms resemble one another, and that's intentional. They are, if you like, a kind of family of contracts, so that once you understand one of them quite well, it's much easier to understand the others, the other forms which are for different types of works that I'll be discussing. So that I think is a useful and practical thing to know. The next point I'd make is each contract is divided into, each standard form of contract is divided into general conditions and particular conditions. And general conditions are those conditions of contract that generally tend to apply to all works of the particular type concerned. So if it's the Red Book, we're talking about civil works. So there's certain general conditions which in FIDIC's experience generally tend to be the same for all different types of civil engineering works. But of course, every contract has to be adapted to the particular site, to the particular country, the particular parties, and the particular law that's governing the contract. And so what complements the so-called general conditions, which are considered generally to apply to civil engineering contracts as a whole, those are then, for a particular project, subject to the particular conditions, which in effect adapt the general conditions to the particular needs, the particular local requirements of that, and the particular nature of that specific construction project, whatever it might be. If it may be an airport in Chile, obviously it must be adapted to Chilean law and to Chilean conditions, weather and so forth. So that would be dealt with in the particular conditions. The next point is, while, as I mentioned, the FIDIC forms, the original FIDIC form, the Red Book, was derived from an English form of contract back in the 1950s, and that, of course, England being a common law jurisdiction, the FIDIC forms have been progressively adapted so that they are accepted to apply in both civil and common law jurisdictions, so that nearly all the clauses, not all of them, I'm afraid, yet, but nearly all of them can be applied readily in civil law countries as well as in common law countries. But some adaptation is normally necessary to take account of the legal requirements of the jurisdiction where the construction works are being executed. The forms of contract, the FIDIC forms, are available in multiple languages, including, among others, Spanish and Portuguese. But if you look at the FIDIC forms, they say that the authentic version of the FIDIC forms is in the English language. So that is where you need to turn back to. You need to turn back to the English version to know exactly what FIDIC intended by the contract, if there's any issue of translation. But obviously, that's a matter that needs to be dealt with by the governing law in your contract and what it says about the language version of the contract, which is to bind the parties. Then finally, as I think I've already touched on, is the FIDIC forms are endorsed by, in fact, one could say not just endorsed by, but even mandated by the World Bank and various other multilateral development banks, including the Inter-American Development Bank. That is to say that when those banks are providing financing for the project, they will require that the project be executed using a particular standard form of contract, and they endorse and in some cases require that the construction contract for the project that the bank is financing be a FIDIC form of contract. Yes, we can turn to the next PowerPoint. Victor, please. So I've mentioned already, I've put in the PowerPoint the three most important FIDIC forms of contract. Those are, the first one listed is for building and engineering works, generally civil engineering works, and designed by the employer. As a practical matter, the designer will not be the employer because the employer often knows nothing about construction. It simply wants to have the work built so that it can use it. So as a practical matter, the design will be done by often a consulting engineering firm acting for the employer and in contract with the employer. But that is the Red Book, and that is the so-called flagship contract, or the main FIDIC form of contract, the best known FIDIC form of contract. Then the second form is the conditions of contract for plant and design build for electrical and mechanical plant designed by the contractor. So that's a fundamental difference between the two contracts. In the Red Book, the design is supplied by or on behalf of the employer. In the case of the Yellow Book, the design is provided by the contractor. And when I say design, I mean most of the design. Of course, the other party may have some design requirements, but most of the design under a Yellow Book is done by the contractor, whereas under the Red Book, it is done by the employer. The other characteristic of those two forms of contract is that they're normally contracts that are let out by international competitive bidding. And indeed, that's often a requirement of the World Bank or the other banks financing the project. So that's those two contracts, and those are the traditional FIDIC forms of contract. But in 1999, for the first time, FIDIC published another form of contract. That's the conditions of contract for EPC turnkey projects, the Silver Book, known as the Silver Book form of contract. Now, this was quite controversial when it was announced and when it was published, because it was prepared and published in response to the demand for a construction contract that would be suitable for a privately funded projects. And as those of you familiar with project finance will know, banks do not want to take construction risk. And the banks, and particularly private banks, were unhappy with the Red Book and the Silver Book and the Yellow Books because risk is allocated, as I've said before, fairly allocated between the employer and the contractor. Well, the bank said, look, we're happy to finance a project. We're happy to provide money, for example, to the employer for the project, but we don't want to see the employer who borrows our money exposed to construction risk, if at all possible. So we want the contractor to take all risks relating to construction. The contractor's an expert in construction. We're just banks. We don't know anything about construction. We're not interested in construction. We don't want to take construction risk. So we want a form of contract where the maximum risk of, the risk of cost overruns or the risk of delays, which lead in turn to cost overruns, of course, we want those risks taken by the contractor to the extent possible. So there was a lot of controversy about that within FIDIC. Should FIDIC be, addressing this issue, this demand in the marketplace for a kind of one-sided contract? And so FIDIC ultimately decided that it should do so, and it issued, in 1999, the first edition of the Silver Book for these contracts, which place they were EPC or turnkey projects, which place the maximum amount of risk on the contractor. But there is, I just point out to you, there is in the introduction to the Silver Book, there's some cautionary statements saying the Silver Book should not be used for really high-risk projects, such as where there's a lot of underground work or things like that. In other words, FIDIC still wanted to see, even in the case of the Silver Book, that the risk that's placed on the contractor is risk that the contractor can fairly estimate and evaluate, and so that the contractor was not made into a gambler, which has never been considered a good thing for a contractor to be, if possible. So, but in any event, that is the Silver Book. It came out, and new editions of all these three contracts were published in 2017, the previous ones being the 1999 editions. So that's those three contracts. We can take a look at the next PowerPoint, Victor, please. And you'll see they're easily identified by their cover. The red book having a red cover, the yellow book a yellow cover, and the silver book a silver cover. And each one, the general conditions of each of these contracts is somewhat over, of 2017, is somewhat over 100 pages. Now, the one other thing I would like to point out in relation to these contracts is that they were amended in 2022. And they were not, the amendments are not substantial in terms of words, but they are important in terms of what was amended. And therefore, I would recommend any of you who are thinking of using these forms of contract, make sure that you are using the 2017 forms as amended by the 2022 amendments. And in fact, if you contact FIDIC, that's what they'll make available to you, I think, the 2017 contracts as amended in 2022, because they recognize those amendments are important and, in fact, in my view, should have been made in the 2017 contracts when they were issued, but for various reasons, they were not incorporated in them. So just use the 2017 contracts as amended in 2022. So let's take a look at the next PowerPoint. So since 2017, FIDIC has published 2 new forms of contract, which I think are both, and I'm quite critical of the FIDIC forms often, as if you look at my book, you'll see I am critical. I've always been critical because I've always been conscious of the fact that they are imperfect and they are complicated documents and they can always be improved. And I've never hesitated in saying how I thought they should be improved. But that being said, I do think, and I've reviewed quite carefully these 2 new forms, and I would say these are, in terms of quality, about as good forms as FIDIC has ever issued. And the first one, which I think is very relevant to Chile, is conditions of contract for underground works. Underground works designed by the contractor. Well, I won't go more into it because the contracts are complicated, but it's basically for tunneling works, for example. And this contract is called the Emerald Book. If you know anything about tunneling construction, and if you speak to tunneling engineers, they'll tell you that there's more and more tunneling done around the world, more and more building underground everywhere in the world. This is increasing, perhaps aided by the fact that tunneling has become technically easier to do. But of course, no one knows geological conditions underground. So the big difficulty with tunneling contracts is the difficulty of predicting underground conditions. Are they going to be easy to excavate or hard to excavate? And this has huge cost and time implications. So there is no construction project that is more riskier than building underground. So the question is, how do we deal with this? How do we allocate the risk between the contractor and the employer in relation to unforeseen underground conditions that are being encountered regularly, of course, in tunneling and other underground projects? Anyway, the Emerald Book addresses that issue in a way that's never been addressed before in an international form of contract, and I think it addresses it very well. It had great experts working on preparing these contracts, including a top Swiss. It was chaired by a Swiss tunneling expert, and they certainly know lots about tunneling. Anyway, I commend you to that contract if you ever need to get involved in a project for underground works. Then we can turn to the next slide. Yes, this is the other new form that I think is also excellent. I said that the red, yellow, and silver books are quite long contracts. The general conditions, that is to say the conditions that are considered generally applicable to the type of work concerned, as opposed to those particular conditions which adapt the contract to the particular site, the particular country, the particular governing law, and so on. I said the general conditions of the red, yellow, and silver books were over 100 pages long. The general conditions of the green book are just 30 pages long. So it's a shorter form of contract for smaller works or repetitive works when you're building, repeatedly the same kind of thing, the same kind of house or whatever it may be, a small house or whatever it is. And generally for works of less than $10 million. And it is a distinctive feature of the red and yellow books, and indeed I could have mentioned this earlier, I should have perhaps mentioned this earlier, is that and this will be quite different from probably contracts you may be familiar with in Chile, is that under the red and yellow books, the contract is administered on behalf of the employer by the engineer. In other words, the employer itself does not administer, does not oversee the construction works, does not determine, does not value the works or determine how much of the works have been built and what the contractor should be paid. The employer does not do that. Under a red and yellow book contract, that is done by the engineer, who acts as a kind of intermediary between the contractor and the employer, and who, as I say, will determine what is due each month to the contractor for the work it has executed in the previous month, or who will decide on the claims of the contractor against the employer, or indeed of the claims of the employer against the contractor in the first instance. So the engineer has a lot of power and authority, and is meant to act fairly between the two parties, although, of course, the engineer is engaged and paid by the employer, but the engineer commits itself to act as a fair intermediary between the two parties. And that's a very distinctive feature of how FIDIC contracts, and particularly the red and yellow books, and to some extent the green book, are administered, and which will be different from experience with construction contracts I think in Latin America and in civil law countries generally, because this is a distinctively common law system. But I think, finally, I'd say the green book is the easiest one for anyone who's not familiar with FIDIC contracts to begin with, because it's shorter, it's rather easy to understand, and it also embodies at the same time all of the lessons and all the experience that FIDIC and FIDIC's engineers have acquired in drafting the red and yellow books. So it's kind of the fruit of all that, and it's really an excellent contract in my opinion. Let's take a look at the next slide, if we could, please, Victor. And once again, that's the cover page of the two contracts, the green book on the left and the emerald book. That's meant to be an emerald color. I don't know if it's quite emerald, but anyway, that's what it's meant to be, the cover of the underground of the emerald book. Then we can turn to the next slide, please. And then, now what about the use of FIDIC contracts in the Americas, particularly in Latin America? Well, there are no reliable statistics. I don't know anyone who knows for sure how much and to what extent FIDIC contracts have been used in the Americas. But thanks to some very helpful advice I've received from some of the people who are listening to us today, including Julio Bueno and Oscar Aitken, and perhaps others, I have put together this slide indicating the use of FIDIC contracts in various countries in the Americas. And you'll see I also indicate whether the contract is a red book, a yellow book contract, or a silver book contract. You'll see I refer in some cases to something called a pink book. Just for your information, the pink book is a red book contract which has been amended to satisfy the World Bank's requirements. So it's close to the red book, but the World Bank has special requirements, particularly requirements relating to social welfare, protection of labor, protection of the environment, which are more extensive than those in the FIDIC form. And so those are reflected in the pink book form, which, as I say, is a form approved for use by the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. I think the Inter-American Development Bank may also have endorsed the pink book. And indeed, I recall working myself on the project in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the water project, pink book, that was financed by the Inter-American Development Bank, for example. But then you'll see in Chile, the silver book has been used, to my knowledge, on 2 run-of-the-river hydro projects, the red book on the construction of a pier, the yellow book for a hydro power plant. And but then you see it's been used in other countries of Latin America and in the British Caribbean, but not in the United States or in Canada, because in those countries, they have their own domestic forms of contract, and therefore they do not use international forms of contract. And of course, they don't get funding from the World Bank or other multilateral development banks. Yeah, let's take a look at the next slide, if we could. So often these projects that I've described are financed by the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other financing entities, as I've indicated in the slide. I've noted that Peru especially seems to be forward-looking in adopting best international construction contract practices, and FIDIC contracts seem to be especially used there. They're not used in the US and Canada, as I've already explained. But one other particular feature I should mention, which was introduced in the 1999 contracts, FIDIC contracts, and which is, of course, contained in the current 2017 forms, is the provision for a dispute board. Before the dispute board was introduced into these forms of contract, they had provided that claims and disputes were to be decided by the engineer, who, as I've explained, is hired and paid by one party, the employer. Well, that was not a very satisfactory system because the engineer was not independent of one of the parties. But in 1999, the dispute board was introduced into the FIDIC forms of contract, and the dispute board consists of 1 or 3 people who are required to be independent of the parties and to decide disputes fairly and impartially between the parties. And that is certainly a much better, more effective system. And I think you're familiar with the dispute board in Chile, because as I believe you have laws regulating the use of dispute boards in Chile. We can turn to the next slide. And then this is really my last slide. And this reflects partly what I understand is the situation in Chile, but in Latin America generally, is that the great majority of work undertaken in Latin America has been public works, to which administrative law, but that's to say public law, including conditions of contract established by public law, apply. And these laws and conditions are often matters of public policy and cannot be modified. There are few, as I understand it, standard forms of contract developed by private bodies or institutions, such as FIDIC, in Latin America, and none specifically designed for international construction. Accordingly, I think FIDIC contracts will satisfy and do satisfy an important need in Latin America, and in particular on projects that are financed from international sources, such as the World Bank or other multilateral development banks, or by international banking consortia, as was the case with the Panama Canal expansion. So big infrastructure projects in Latin America that are financed from these public sources or from private banks, say in New York or London or another financial center. Those projects, in the case of those projects, there is likely to be a push by the financing entities for the use of best international construction contract practice. And that will often, if not usually, mean FIDIC contracts, as there really are a few other forms that can really claim seriously to be international standard forms of contract. And I would say, I would just add here, FIDIC has recently created something called the FIDIC Academy, which is FIDIC's educational and development body. And this body has been set up in order to help train engineers and other construction professionals in developing countries in the use of FIDIC contracts. And there's been a big push by FIDIC to do this, I believe, prompted by the World Bank and the other other public financing bodies, because they say, look, we're financing and we're going to be financing more and more major infrastructure projects around the world, but we need to have local people who are familiar with the best international construction contract practices, who can administer, supervise, and oversee these projects and ensure that they're executed properly, and that public funds that we're going to provide are used efficiently. And therefore we need skilled engineers and construction professionals to administer and to execute these projects, and they need to come primarily, of course, from the countries where the works are being executed, and therefore they need to be trained, and FIDIC get on and train them. Well, in response to that, FIDIC has set up what's called this FIDIC Academy, and it is now very actively and very busily developing courses and to train professionals in developing countries around the world. I think with that development also, you're going to see more and more use of FIDIC forms internationally, including, I expect, in Chile. So I will stop there, and thank you very much, and really would welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for your speech. It was an excellent speech, and a very deep overview about FIDIC contracts. I missed at the beginning to say that Christopher Seppala has a very interesting book, like a Bible, about FIDIC contracts. It was just published, the FIDIC Red Book Contract, an international clause-by-clause commentary. I highly recommend this book. It has more than 1,300 pages. It's a very deep analysis of each clause of the FIDIC contract. So I think that if you want to learn about a FIDIC contract, you should read this book. Well, before going to questions, I would like Chris to ask a couple of questions. The first one, which FIDIC book is more widely used in civil law countries, and why? And the second one is about the procurement guide of FIDIC, about incorporation of a balanced risk sharing. I think that to face a balanced risk sharing, a very important key when you are negotiating and when you have to make an agreement about some clauses. So if we could give your opinion about these two subjects, please.
Yes, well, thank you, Juan Eduardo. The reality is that FIDIC contracts and no particular one, I think it's true of the red, the yellow, or the silver books, are used more widely in civil law countries than in common law countries. That should not be surprising, considering that there are many more civil law countries than there are common law countries. According to statistics I've read, there's something like 130 civil law countries and about 80 common law countries. It's well known that perhaps the biggest use of the FIDIC contracts have been in the Middle East. And the Middle East is almost entirely civil law. And that has not presented any particular problems. So whether it's a red book or a yellow book or a silver book, all of them are used in civil law countries. And while each contract needs to be adapted, of course, to the law that is governing it to some extent, there are bound to be some changes or some adaptation. They are perfectly usable in civil law countries, just as they are in common law countries. On the question of the procurement guide, the FIDIC procurement guide, yes, advocates, as does FIDIC, a balanced risk sharing, because in the experience of FIDIC and in the experience of, well, I would say of FIDIC's engineers, that tends to lead to the most successful projects. It tends to be, in other words, projects that are not plagued or troubled or affected by cost overruns or termination of the contractor or bankruptcy of the contractor. On the whole, the most successful projects are projects that have been based upon contracts with balanced risk sharing. That is FIDIC's experience, and that's what they say in the FIDIC procurement procedures guide. Does that address your question, or?
Yes. Before going to the floor, I would like to ask you another question. You told us the importance of dispute boards. I would like to know your opinion about the new books of 2017, where they create the dispute avoidance adjudication board. Which are their main functions, and what do you think about this change?
Thank you very much. That is an important question, Juan Eduardo. In 1999, what was introduced into the FIDIC forms of contract was something called a dispute adjudication board. And that board basically replaced the old, the function that had previously been performed by the engineer. And the function the engineer had performed was simply to make a decision on a dispute before it was referred to arbitration. That was a condition to arbitration, that the dispute first be referred to the engineer before it could go to arbitration. In fact, that usually meant in practice that the engineer had a second bite at the apple, because in this normal case, the contractor will have presented a claim originally to the engineer. The engineer will have rejected that claim or only accepted it in part. The contractor would then be unhappy with the result, and there would then be a dispute. That is how a dispute was commonly defined. In other words, a claim of the contractor that had been rejected by the engineer and which and where the contractor did not accept that the engineer's rejection, then there would be a dispute, which under the old FIDIC forms, the contractor was then meant to refer back to the engineer as a dispute for its formal decision. And often that meant, for example, the initial claim had been addressed by, say, a local engineer on the site, whereas when it was referred back as a dispute to the engineer, it was then often referred to the home office of the engineer, which may be in another country, and to a more senior engineer within the engineer's organization, and they would make a decision. Well, that decision on a dispute function was replaced in 1999 by a dispute board, which, as I explained, was a better system because the dispute board was obviously neutral. So that was 1999. Now, in 2017, as you point out, Juan Eduardo, we no longer have a dispute adjudication board. We now have what's called a dispute avoidance and adjudication board. And why is that? The reason for that is it has been concluded since 1999 that what the board should mainly be doing in the first instance is assisting the parties to avoid disputes or to resolve them amicably. And so the dispute board has now been given the function not merely to resolve disputes, as was its main function in 1999, but equally, if not more important, to assist the parties to resolve disputes amicably, or to resolve any issues or claims that arise between them amicably without there even becoming a dispute. That is, and so as that is now become an important function of the dispute board, the title of the board has been changed from being a dispute adjudication board to being a dispute avoidance and adjudication board. And so that dispute avoidance function is now as important, probably even considered more important than the dispute adjudication function.
Thank you, Chris. I would, in this audience, we have a lot of arbitrators. So perhaps it's interesting, your opinion, because there are numerous provisions in FIDIC contracts which deal with contract interpretation. How they works before arbitral tribunals, this type of clause?
Well, I just mentioned, by the way, you mentioned my book. Thank you very much, Juan Eduardo. Actually, I have a chapter in the book on interpreting FIDIC contracts because I spent quite a bit of time looking at that issue. If you, as I've explained, the major FIDIC forms of contract are about 100 pages long. They have in them about 100 definitions as well. And a number of clauses dealing with contract interpretation. So there's quite a lot in the contracts themselves about how they should be interpreted, including, of course, the defined terms, but also there's provisions about when issues arise under the contract of interpretation, they would first be referred normally to the engineer who would give an initial interpretation of the contract. But of course, when it gets to arbitration, the arbitrators are expected, the contract will be governed by a particular law, and the contract and the arbitrators are expected to apply the law that governs the contract, and that law will normally have rules dealing with contract interpretation, which the arbitrators must look to. So in interpreting the contract, the first thing they need to do is understand the contract, which is quite complex and has a number of provisions dealing with interpretation in it. And then once they've mastered the contract and mastered the relevant provisions of the contract, they then need to take account of of the rules on contract interpretation of the governing law. That's basically what they need to do.
On the other hand, Christopher, are international legal principles like UNIDROIT a natural complement to an international form of contract like FIDIC? Would you give your opinion about this subject?
Yes, thank you very much, Juan Eduardo. And I know you have written on the UNIDROIT principles and are a believer in them, as am I. I think the UNIDROIT principles are a natural complement to an international standard form of contract, and it is in fact very common for international arbitrators to look to the UNIDROIT principles to complement whatever the governing law may provide. And certainly in a number of countries where FIDIC contracts are used, as those countries are often developing countries, the law may not be very detailed or very sophisticated and may not clearly address some of the issues to which a complex construction project can give rise. And there, it is certainly, and when the governing law does not address those issues, it's certainly very helpful to be able to look, for example, to the UNIDROIT principles to see if they can provide guidance and fill in any gaps that may exist in the governing law, dealing with how a particular issue is to be resolved.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Any question from the audience?
Juan Eduardo, if I may, I would like to congratulate you and Victor for bringing Chris, which is a celebrity in our construction law debates, for this very good presentation, and you and Oscar and Victor brought him to us. So my question to Chris would be, how does he see the issues of fit for purpose and good
Julio,
faith?
we are not listening you.
Oh,
is
it better?
Question, please?
Is it better now?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. First, is it better now?
Yes. We are.
Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you. First, I was just saying congratulations for having Chris to guide us through the FIDIC forms. So it was a great speech, as you mentioned. My question to Chris would be whether he thinks that fit for the purpose or good faith principles, they play along well in civil law countries when reading the FIDIC forms.
Yeah, well, the FIDIC forms incorporate the principle in the common law, at least, that where a contractor is both designing and building a work, it has a responsibility for ensuring that that work, whatever it may be, is fit for purpose. In other words, it will do what it is ordinarily expected to do, whether it's a dam holding the water of a river, or a house being fit for habitation, as one would expect of a house. The contractor who has designed and built that house has an obligation to ensure that the thing he has constructed is fit for its normal use, and that is a common law principle, but it is also incorporated into the FIDIC forms of contract, particularly the Yellow Book, but also to some extent in the Red Book, and I regard that merely as being kind of common sense. It is a legal principle, but it's also, I would say, a common sense principle that someone who agrees to design and build something for somebody should ensure that that object, whatever it is it can do ordinarily what it's expected to do, and if it doesn't achieve that result, the contractor is responsible. But that principle is reflected in the FIDIC forms, but it's reflected in the foot, but it's spelt out. In other words, I think it's clear from the words of the form that principle applies. There's nothing, in other words, if a party is unhappy with that and wants to change it or adapt it, or for example, define the purpose in a particular way, it is free to do so. Because bear in mind, we're here talking about standard forms that always need to be adapted and take account of the particular conditions and the particular nature of the project that's being built. They cannot and they should not be used blindly. They always require some adaptation. Now, on the principle of good faith, that contracts be performed in good faith, of course, that's a fundamental doctrine in the civil law, a very important one, and it's actually a topic that I address in detail in my book, because it's a very important civil law principle, and it's also very interesting to see how in common law jurisdictions, increasingly one sees references, increasingly the civil law system and the common law system are growing closer together on this issue of whether the contract should be performed in good faith. The common law may not use always the same term as, that a contract should be performed in good faith, but it uses other terms which achieve the same results, such as, notably in the common law system, the doctrine of implied terms. Something that is implied in the common law into a contract is often the result of application of the doctrine of good faith in civil law countries. So I see the two legal systems getting closer and closer in that respect. For example, as you know, you have the doctrine of contracts should be performed in good faith to some extent already in the US law and in Canadian law, to cite two common law jurisdictions where you have this doctrine. But it is important, and as I say, I give a lot of attention to it in the book, and I'd be delighted, Julia, in your comments on what I've said there, if you get to read them.
Many thanks, Chris. Excellent.
Thank you, Chris. Any other question from the floor?
I have a question, Chris. Perhaps it's a more, let's say, political question in the sense that how, in your experience worldwide regarding FIDIC contracts, what do you have knowledge of any experience in any country that how to make FIDIC contracts more applicable in a more wide extension? Because in Chile, for example, as you mentioned, we have some examples, but it's not very usual, I would say. So even FIDICs has a very fair allocation risk. FIDICs represent very good practice in construction law, but for somehow, I don't know why, perhaps Oscar or Eduardo or whatever, anybody else could help us in this analysis, but what do you think, which will be the way to do FIDIC contracts more applicable?
I think, I think the best thing would be just experience. You've already had a number of FIDIC, a number of projects in Chile which have been executed using FIDIC forms of contract. It'd be very interesting to see and to know what changes were made to those FIDIC forms for those projects to adapt them to the Chilean legal environment. There must be experience there. Now, it may not be publicly available, I understand, but certainly organizations like your Society of Construction Law would be the perfect forum in which to explore what adaptation should be made to the FIDIC forms to make them usable in the best way in Chile, in the Chilean legal and engineering environment. That would be a great thing, I think, for the SCL to explore. And indeed, if you look around, there is literature and people are writing about it, are writing about the use of FIDIC in different countries. There's quite a lot of literature on that if you look around, so that you can also look at the experience of other countries. Certainly, I'm sure Julio Bueno can tell us about what changes are necessary and he's made in Brazil and in projects he's been concerned with, which may be relevant to the situation in Chile. But there has been quite a lot of writing on this subject in relation to other countries. In other words, what adaptations should be made to FIDIC forms for those countries, which some of that may be relevant to the situation in Chile.
Excellent. Thank you.
I believe, Victor, that one of our main difficulties in Chile is that people are not familiar with FIDIC contracts, not enough at all. So perhaps the idea that gave us Christopher to have some relations with FIDIC Academy, the Chilean Society of Construction Law could organize a seminar with FIDIC Academy to work this subject. Perhaps it's the beginning to work in this field.
Excellent. Very, very good idea. I agree.
We are.
Yeah, that would be good, Juan Eduardo. In fact, I have the title. It's a rather pretentious title, but I'm Dean of Contracts of the FIDIC Academy. If I can be of any assistance, of course, I know the people there very well. In taking your idea further, please let me know, of course.
Thank you very much, Christopher. We will do it. Well, we are on time, but before finishing, I would like to know if you could tell us about your book, where we could find your book, which is the editorial, and it's available online. Could you give us some information?
Yes, well, actually, I think, I don't know, Victor, but did my publisher send a brochure for the book to you, or have you seen a brochure of the book? Because I know my publisher, I told them about this event, and they said that they would be happy to make the book available to anyone who participated in the event and who interested in buying it at a discount, and they gave a discount code and so forth and so on. So the publisher is Wolters Kluwer in the Netherlands. Did you
I don't think so yet, but once received it, of course, we will distribute to our partners.
Okay, well, I'll make sure you receive it, Victor, no problem at all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. It was an excellent meeting with you. I hope we could keep in touch, and please feel free to contact us when you need it. The Chilean Society of Construction Law, it's quite active, and we are a group of engineers and lawyers that we're working together in construction law. So thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Eduardo. Really, it's been a pleasure for me and very interesting for me to participate in this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, for the same, Chris, thank you again very much, and I hope this will be the first, well, not the first, you have been in Chile in our Congress, so thank you for being in touch with us. Thank you, Juan Eduardo, for being as a contact for this opportunity, and well, let's be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you allow me to switch off to Spanish, just for some, para algunos avisos de utilidad pública muy breves. Contarles que el día 2 de octubre tenemos planificada nuestra asamblea anual. Le vamos a enviar la comunicación respectiva y vamos a aprovechar esa oportunidad. Tenemos unos muy interesantes invitados para llevar adelante, bajo la coordinación y moderación de nuestro director Rodrigo Riquelme, una especie de resumen, análisis de lo que han sido los observatorios judiciales en materia de fallos y sentencias en materia de derecho a la construcción, que creemos que va a ser muy interesante. Vamos a hacer un solo acto, uno a continuación del otro, con la asamblea, y luego el plato de fondo con esta actividad. Y mañana estamos participando en un seminario que organizó la Cámara Chilena en Punta Arenas sobre proyectos de energía e infraestructura en Magallanes, en conjunto con nuestros socios Juan Eduardo Bubinich y nuestro socio, miembro además de la Contraloría General de la República de Punta Arenas, Gonzalo Fuentealba, que también es socio de la sociedad. Así que, si la voz me lo permite, voy a poder también conversar allá mañana sobre esos interesantes temas, que también va a ser transmitido en formato, bueno, va a ser presencial, pero va a ser transmitido en forma híbrida para que los que puedan se puedan conectar mañana a las 9:30 AM. Así que muchísimas gracias a todos nuestros socios, quienes nos han acompañado hoy día en esta interesante charla de Christopher Seppala, una referencia mundial, diría yo, en materia de Construction Law. Y esta sesión ha sido grabada con la autorización de Christopher y podrá ser puesta a disposición de nuestros socios que no pudieron estar hoy día con nosotros. Así que muchísimas gracias también, Juan Eduardo, por tu apoyo en esta actividad, muy interesante. Y thank you again, Chris, for your participation.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Gracias.
Bye.